In the late 1800s, scientists were debating theories about how light traveled through space. Some thought there must be a substance, they called it ether, that fills space so light would have a medium to travel through, like sound waves traveling through air. The Michelson-Morley experiment was an attempt to resolve the mystery. They designed an experiment assuming that if light traveled through ether, its speed would probably be affected. So they measured the speed of light coming from a distant star while the Earth, in its orbit around the Sun, was moving towards that star, and again while the Earth was moving away from it. They failed to find any difference in the two speeds. The failure of the Michelson-Morley experiments gave rise to two incorrect assumptions. First, they assumed that ether was not present, and then they assumed that space must, therefore, be empty. Trying to imagine how light could travel through empty space led to the creation of a mysterious electromagnetic wave. It was an imaginary vehicle that could travel through empty space without the need for a medium of travel like ether or anything else. Unlike sound that needs air or water or any number of other substances as a medium of travel, this wave was its own medium. It was sort of like a high-speed bullet train. All photons jump aboard at the source and travel through space to infinity if unobstructed, without losing any energy. If something detected the light, then all the photons jumped off the train and were absorbed into the atoms of the detector. And while this concept of light travel was easy to grasp, the loading and unloading of photons was left unexplained. The wave and the bullet train are equally imaginative, and both are equally mysterious. The scientists don't usually come right out and say this, that the wave can travel to infinity with no loss of energy. But they have an equation, E equals hv, where E is the energy of a photon, h is Planck's constant, and v is the frequency of the wave. And they're very careful with their words. They might say, the energy of a photon of monochromatic light will measure the same regardless of the distance traveled. And experiments easily verify that statement. It is absolutely true. The equation has no distance factor, no indication that the wave has any travel limits. And since space was assumed to be empty, there would be nothing to slow it down. So, without actually saying that the electromagnetic wave can travel to infinity with no loss of energy, it is sort of implied. It's like the kind of weird uncle that shows up at family reunions. We feed him and tolerate his bad jokes, but when we are with normal people, we just don't talk about him. Well, I'm going to talk about him. One of the fundamental assumptions that led to the introduction of the wave theory of light is that space is empty. I know that is not true. Light is entirely a particle phenomenon. Photons of light fill the immensity of space, and I'm not alone in this. Many scientists know that space is full. Now, they don't know exactly what it's full of, so they speculate that atoms make up only 4.9% of space, 26.8% is something they call dark matter, and 68.3% is dark energy. Now, they call it dark because they don't really know what it is. The speculation is largely based on the notion that gravity is solely responsible for the swirling motion of the galaxies and various other subparts. And the tiny 4.9% atom content is way too small to generate enough gravity to account for all that motion. Now, I have already explained that photons of light fill the immensity of space. Space was never empty. Michelson and Morley just imagined light to be a much simpler structure, one that you could represent as a single arrow that would slow down if it had to travel through ether. That simplistic view of light is totally inadequate when you try to explain the behavior of light in conditions of significant relative motion. And I explained that in Part 3, entitled Light and Relative Distance. So, if space was never empty, then there was no reason to introduce this impossibly simplistic notion of an electromagnetic wave. Traveling to infinity with no loss of energy isn't the only weird relative in the electromagnetic wave family. All of the waves are monochromatic, and this means that there is a constant frequency and amplitude of the wave. It also means that all the photons of light for that particular frequency are the same size and measure at the same photon energy level. Well, size matters. If photons of monochromatic light of a particular color are all the same size, and the atoms of a particular detector will only absorb photons of a particular size, then what happens to light when we move the detector at speeds significant to the speed of light c? At 86.6% of c, mass is doubled. That means the atoms of the detector are twice as large as they were before it accelerated. If all the laws of science remain the same regardless of the speed of the observer, then the size of the photons capable of being absorbed into the detector atoms must be proportionally larger as well. But if the photon size is fixed, then the larger detector atom will not absorb it, and the light will go undetected. In essence, all the stars in the heavens would disappear from view. A deeper and more obvious flaw is the notion of a wave itself. It assumes that wave energy changes states in a pattern of a sine wave, oscillating smoothly from some peak value down to zero. This is clearly a violation of Max Planck's discovery that proved energy can only change states in quantum leaps. There is an even more serious problem with the electromagnetic wave. On the right is a fair representation of how scientists imagine the wave. It shows the relationship of the magnetic field to the electric field as perpendicular to each other. However, it depicts both fields as two-dimensional. In my opinion, if something physical is real, it exists in 3 dimensions, even if it is invisible to the naked eye. If you try to imagine the wave in 3 dimensions, it turns into a string of beads where the magnetic and electric fields lose their individual identities and their perpendicular relationship. The electromagnetic wave as depicted is not real and does not reasonably represent the true nature of light. Then there is this nagging little logic problem. Michelson and Morley supposedly proved that space was empty, so there was no ether. Consequently, scientists imagine that light must be traveling on an electromagnetic wave. But if stars had been emitting electromagnetic waves for billions of years, space would have been full of those waves. So space cannot possibly be empty. Unless, of course, we imagine this wave to have magical powers, so it can transmit light energy from all those distant stars to every other place in space without leaving any trace in space that it ever passed through space. Now that was the kind of thinking that led Einstein to introduce the concept of relative mass. Perhaps scientists thought they could just call it relative energy. The energy was real at the source and real at all destinations, but it wasn't real in the regions between. The perpendicular relationship between the electric field and the magnetic field is, however, very real, and it is reasonably depicted by the right-hand rule of electronics. Notice how the plane formed by the curling fingers, representing the magnetic field, is perpendicular to the thumb, representing the electric current flow. Scientists generally agree that a weather tornado draws warm air from the Earth's surface into its spin. It is then exhausted in an updraft towards the cold air above. Notice the perpendicular relationship between the swirls of air and the updraft of warm air. Now let's take another look at the energy tornado. It races through the energy ocean at speed c squared. Some photon energy particles are drawn into its spin, which is the magnetic field, while others are exhausted out through its trailing edge, which is electricity. The atom is the sole source of electricity and magnetism. In their natural state, atoms are randomly oriented, exhausting their electrical flow back into the surrounding energy ocean. This tiny individual flow of electricity generally goes unnoticed. Our electrical generation processes tend to realign surface atoms of a wire so that they are all exhausting their electrical flow in one direction, along the wire. And that is what we all recognize as electricity. Larger electric and magnetic fields that exhibit the perpendicular relationship only do so because of sympathetic rotations of the surrounding energy ocean. It is just a larger expression of the magnetic and electric flows. The electromagnetic wave as depicted is not real and does not reasonably represent the true nature of light. It was ill-conceived due to a wrong assumption that space was empty. It has no photon size flexibility to deal with changes in mass due to acceleration. Space travelers moving at speeds different from that of the source would not be able to see the light. The perpendicular relationships between the electric and magnetic fields is only evident when both fields are represented in two dimensions. In a three-dimensional reality, the perpendicular relationship disappears. The wave turns into a string of beads, and the wave representation violates Max Planck's discovery that energy can only change states in quantum leaps. Now, electromagnetic signals exist. Radio, TV, cell phones, and a number of other things routinely send and receive electromagnetic signals. But those signals work even when the senders and receivers are moving at different speeds. And they work because the signals are sent by light, a process that is entirely particle in nature. The relative differences in photon size, detector atom size, and relative distances are all accounted for when you understand the true nature of light. Every light source produces photons in a variety of sizes and traveling at a wide range of speeds. Because this is true, light can be detected by sensors traveling at speeds significantly different from that of the source. It is a more complicated scenario, but it is the only one that works.